Good morning, good morning. Check the registration schedule. This is the Church Transformation Consultation Week, and that's a mouthful. And for you guys who don't get something in your bank account every 2 weeks from Bonham, some of us do that, and so, we're glad you're here too, but it's a Saturday. I want to say to you, no, that's the wrong one. Sorry. Okay, all right, one more time, yes. Give yourself a golf clap for you non-Bonham staff. Thank you for your Saturday morning when you could have been drinking coffee and reading the Wall Street Journal or de-weeding your garden or whatever it may be, for coming here and spending hours upon hours at church in classroom, aka 7208. We have the privilege this morning of hours and hours with Dr. Paul Borden. And if I could just summarize Dr. Borden, I just want to say this, and I hope you get the spirit of this. Just with two words: capital T, the, capital M, man. Okay? Paul is the man. Okay? Tiger Woods wears red and black on Sunday for the victory, for the kill. Paul Borden wears only black. Okay? He's the man in black.
Yeah.
But ECO, our denomination, in case you don't know, has said to Paul, we need churches to turn around. 95% of churches in America today are either plateauing or declining. Unfortunately, is part of that 95%. But, no pressure, Paul, but we need to be in the 5%.
Right.
And you're going to make it work.
Right.
So, Paul has been a pastor. Paul has been a consultant. Paul has done consultations for years. This is around number 300. Ish.
Over
300.
Yeah.
So he's been on the block a couple times with these things. And so we are in good hands this morning to have Paul Borden lead us toward church transformation. I sat in Colorado Springs at First Pres, Colorado Springs in January. I've heard him speak. I've heard of the legend of Paul Borden, but went to his plenary and then his breakout groups, and I said, we need to get him here at Bonham, because what he is saying makes sense, and it's what we need. And so I'm excited to have him here. Karen and I had a lot of food at Yaya's with him last night, and got even more excited about what he's going to share with us today. So without further ado, give Dr. Borden a nice Presbyterian.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Okay. Thank you. Let's start with a word of prayer, shall we? Our gracious God, I thank you today for your grace in our lives, for bringing us to yourself, for providing a way through Jesus Christ for us to have a relationship with you, for making us part of your body, for giving us gifts and talents, and a commission of service to bring honor and glory to your name. I pray that in our time together today, the Spirit of God might invade all that happens. And as we interact, as we talk, as we discuss, as we consider what you want for that which you care deeply about, your church, that your Spirit will be at work in our midst. Because apart from you, we all know nothing happens. So I ask for this, not only for our sakes, but for your honor and for your glory. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. By the way, the reason we are recording this, the mic is for the recording. On Tuesday, when the email blast goes out, there will be a link for the whole day of training that anyone in the congregation can look at and listen to and be a part of. So that's why we're doing that. I want to answer the first question that all of you are asking and have been too nice to articulate. And that is, what in the world are we going to do from 9 to 3? Okay, now, I used to teach students to preach at Denver Seminary. And I always said the first thing you offer the congregation is hope. So I want to offer you hope. We're not going to go all the way to 3 o'clock. Okay. I don't mean by that 2:55 either. Okay. Maybe 2:30, maybe 2:15. But because I want today to be about hope. And I want to offer hope. Now, part of offering that hope is being honest about reality, but also demonstrating a way that God can take a reality that isn't always that great and make it much better and much more effective. So if you are here today, the main thing I want to happen is that tomorrow, when you see the report that will be given to everyone in the congregation, and we're going to go through it, it's only 4 pages, because people do not read long reports. It's a short report. When you go through that report, you will have a better understanding of the whys. Why are we saying that? And secondly, you will already know by the end of today what most of the things I'm going to be saying. This is what I believe the congregation should do. So there should be few, if any, surprises for you tomorrow when you see the report. So that's the purpose of today, so that you as what I would call the leadership community have an understanding of why we're saying what we're saying. Now, I have been told by many people, I have talked to over 80 people either in individual interviews or focus groups or whatever. Many people have said, we want to grow. Many people have said, we want to see God do something. I've had people say, why can't we have more people in our services? Why can't we have more children here? Why can't we do that? I believe in the United States, where, as your pastor just said, most churches are in plateau or decline. About 50 years ago, there were about 500,000 congregations in the U.S. then, meeting on weekends. Today, the estimate is somewhere between 320 to 340,000 congregations meeting on a weekend. Church attendance has been on decline for 30 years or longer. 4,000 churches a year close. In the last 5 years, we have started about 5,000 churches a year, which is a net increase of 1,000. But you would need to start 10,000 congregations a year simply to keep pace with population growth. So if I can use a business term, the church is losing its market share in our nation. Now, having worked in the church all my life, I'm 75, so I'm old. Okay, and people said, how long have you been going to church? I tell them for 75 years and 9 months. Okay, because my mother took me before I was born. Okay. As I look at the church today, there's only two ways to grow a church. One I believe is unbiblical, and one I believe is biblical. The unbiblical way of growing a church is to outservice all the smaller churches around you. To do what Walmart does when they move into a small town and all the businesses close. Okay? And you have better youth, better children, better preaching, better facilities, better parking, better whatever. And if you do the right things, the church can grow. Okay? Now, it is growing by rearranging sheep. And I want you to know that I am not here today to talk about growth in terms of rearranging sheep. Okay? The other way I am finding churches growing, and as I said to some of you, this is the 27th Eco congregation I have worked with in 3 years. The smallest, I think, was 20. Many of them are under 100. We're seeing 60% of those churches or better now growing. Okay, and God is moving in those churches. Is to say, we have to get back to the main thing. Your church is awesome at the Great Commandment. But you suck at the main thing, if I can be that blunt, which is to make more disciples for Jesus Christ. And everything we're going to talk about, how can your church again be that kind of a church? About 70 years ago, a missionary from Indonesia returned to the United States. Now, we were just coming out of World War II. In the mid-50s, after Korea's over, the interstates are being built. The suburbs are just mushrooming. Churches were growing all over the place. Okay, all kinds of churches were having great experiences. And your church, which almost closed at the end of World War II, began to grow again. Okay, I've read the book, so I know that. Okay, all right. He looked at what it had. Here's all these churches are growing, and he predicted that the state of the church in 2019 would occur. His name was Donald McGavran. He basically became associated with Fuller Seminary, and McGavran really began to lay the ground for the church growth movement. Now, what McGavran in essence was saying is what the church is doing in the rest of the world is different than what the church in the United States is doing. Okay. And he said we, in essence, have to come back and be like missionaries. And we have to see churches function in that sense of being missional. Now, the church growth movement did a lot of great things, but it's 70 years old. And like anything, I'm 75, you begin to break down. Okay. So I want to talk initially about where I'm coming from and what the motives are for what I want to talk about. So if you will take the handout that's in front of you, in fact, I forgot to get mine here, the green and yellow one, you will notice on the left-hand column, at the top it says contrasting church growth motives. Under the church growth movement, here's what's happened today. Most people, when they hear the church growth movement, or say, because I'm often asked, are you a church growth person? Well, yeah, but not in the way you mean it in terms of the model. Because today I find many churches, in fact, I've heard it here, we're afraid of numbers. In fact, if we're just in it for numbers, or a lot of people said, not a lot, but there were some people who said, I like what's here, but this is family. You get too big, blows up the family, So there's the concern of numbers. And the way the numbers are happening today often is through transfer growth. The mega churches, which are doubling every 5 years, are doubling at the expense of all the smaller churches that are, in many cases, going out of business. Now, not all mega churches are in this column, but some are. Now, some people will come to your church because they don't want to go mega church, but they're like Starbucks. Starbucks advertises itself as a boutique experience. But Starbucks devotees want the advantages of the big boxes, the big stores, in a boutique manner. So that whether you're in Kansas City or New York City and you walk into Starbucks and you list those 25 adjectives before you say the word coffee. Okay. You want it to taste exactly the same there as it does here. So people here are saying, yeah, we like family, but we want to make sure we have good music. We want to make sure we have good youth. We want to make sure we have good children. We want to make sure we have good preaching. But we want it for us. Which, so you go into transfer growth, and a lot of times when people talk about growth, it's pride. I've been to enough pastors' conference. The only pastors at pastors' conferences say to other pastors, how many people do you have in church? They have a big church. Okay, because it's all about pride. Okay. It gets down to cultural compromises, passive Christian consumerism. As I will say tomorrow morning, everybody comes to church as a consumer. And most Christians in your church and in all churches sit there every Sunday like Russian ice skating judges. That song was an 8.2. Those announcements were a 1.5. Who's ever preaching hopes that it's a 10.0 with points added for artistic merit. And if the score is high enough, we come back. If it begins to decline, we complain. And if you don't listen to our complaints, we shop for another church. Okay. I heard, one of the reasons why the contemporary service is down and why it's aging are people have gone elsewhere because of youth group or children's ministry or whatever it is, because we shop for churches. But here's also what I think is the most insidious thing that I see is discipleship equals biblical knowledge. Every church I go into, and I've heard it here, we need more Bible study. We need more input. We need more training. Now, I am not against Bible study. In fact, for 20 years in Denver, I had a home Bible study. And for 17 of those years, we literally went from Genesis through Revelation. So I have slugged my way through Lamentations. I have slogged through Nahum. Okay. And I will tell you, there were some nights I didn't want to go because I was bored before I got there. But I do believe in Bible study. But the problem with us as Christians is we don't need to know more Bible. We need to be doing what we know. And so that's the problem. So, what I'm going to be talking about is on the other side of the list. Now, I am going to talk about numbers. And here's why. One of the favorite cities of my wife and myself is Halifax, Canada. And the first time we visited Halifax, I've now worked with churches in Halifax, but the first time we visited Halifax, we did what we normally do is we get on that Gray Line tour bus and take the 3-hour tour where we can look at the city so we can go back and decide where we want to go spend our time. And on this tour, we stopped at a cemetery. We got out of the bus, we walked into the cemetery, and the cemetery was divided into 2 sections. The first section had not a lot of graves in it, relatively speaking, tombstones and the graves, and it was no longer used. The other part of the cemetery was a working cemetery that was still being used. And the reason they took us to that cemetery is the section that was no longer being used, all the bodies buried there, had been floating in the North Atlantic when the Titanic went down. And the fishermen went out, picked up these bodies, most of them with no identification, and they took them back, and that's where all the Titanic people are buried. Now, I would challenge you sometime is Google all the headlines that occurred around the sinking of the Titanic. And almost every headline, because I have looked, says over 2,000 souls lost. Over 700 souls saved. When the U.S. Air flight went down in the Hudson, now we know it landed well because Tom Hanks was the pilot. Okay. When it went down in the Hudson, I watched, and almost even the New York newspapers, 168 souls saved, spared. Newspapers get it, that numbers are people. And I would argue the number one number that any church should be counting, which most churches don't, are how many new disciples have come to Jesus this year through the life of the church. Now, all of us in this room, we all value different things. Some of you may collect this, or you're really interested in this, or you have a hobby here or an avocation here. You value it. But whatever you value, you count. I can prove that. You take 5 kids to Disney World, you count constantly. You take 30 teenagers to a beach day at the beach. Now, you'd like to lose a few, but you count constantly, okay? You're constantly counting. In most of our churches, all that we count, for the most part, are how many people are showing up on Sunday and how much money are they giving. Because our mission is not to reach the community ultimately. The church is run for us, which is why we're going to talk a lot today about evangelism. Now, I know when I use the word evangelism, everybody thinks of a tactic. You know, I mean, do you not have to knock on doors? Do you have to take somebody to a Billy Graham crusade, which today is kind of hard to do? Do you have to go through the 4 spiritual laws? Okay. I'm not talking about tactics. I'm talking about where is the regular presentation of the good news with an invitation for people to respond. How often is that happening? And I'm convinced that if you want to see your church grow biblically, your church, which from my perspective is much more on the left-hand column, has to become a church that reflects the right-hand column. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. That's what I'm going to be presenting. All of that is to say, this is what we need to do. So from my perspective, I believe the church has 2 customers. We have the believers, and we have those who aren't believers yet. And most churches, their number one customer are the believers. There is no growth until the number one customer becomes those who don't know Jesus yet. And when that becomes the mission that drives the church, that's when the church begins to grow. So, let me share with you 3 basic assumptions I work on. And then I'll stop and see if you have any questions. Okay. First assumption. That which is healthy grows and reproduces. If it's healthy, it will grow and reproduce. I live in Sacramento. All of our children live in Denver. Our daughter at one time had 3 little girls under the age of 6. When we would call and talk or communicate with our daughter, and she would say, I just got back from the pediatrician this week with one of the children for their checkup. As a proud grandfather, I would ask 2 questions. By the way, all my grandchildren are exceptional, so yours may be average, but I just want you to mine are exceptional. I would ask 2 questions. How much weight did the baby gain? And how many inches did the baby grow? Okay. Now, the reason why doctors measure infants, weigh infants, is they understand that growth is probably the best sign of health. Now, it's not foolproof. We've all heard of children who were off the charts in terms of growth, who at age 3 need heart surgery. But if you have an infant that is not putting on weight, and you have an infant that is not growing in length, you have a sick baby. Okay. Now, I say this to every church, so don't feel offended and you think I'm saying this personally. I would argue if your church isn't growing, and your church hasn't been growing for over a decade, there is more disease here than there is health. Doesn't mean everything you do is wrong, but there's more disease than health. And part of the role today is to show you how you can have more health than disease. Now, I can show you how to have more health than disease, but here's the problem. Health is a choice. And the older I get, the more difficult the choices. So when I turned 50, my wife said to me, you will go every year for an annual checkup. Now that's not a choice. I do marriage counseling in 15 seconds. Just do what she says. You want a happy marriage, just do what she says. 3 times a week, I holler into the kitchen, I'm sorry, I don't know what I've done, but tell me, and I will not do it again, I promise. Okay. So she said, you'll go for a checkup. Well, about the 3rd year I went for the checkup, the doctor said to me, Paul, you're that age now where we have to check your colon. I said, well, Doc, it's just about right here. Get a Sharpie, put a check mark, and check my colon. He said, we don't do it that way. And when he explained how he did it, I wasn't highly enthused. Now, I didn't have to get my colon checked. Well, if my wife found out, I did, but if she didn't find out, I didn't have, that's a choice. But I did it. Well, the second time they did it, he said, we have found polyps. We have to do your entire colon. I said, can't we settle for a semicolon? He said, no, we don't do it that way. Now, that's a choice, but I did it. 6 months later, when they did it again, he said, the polyps are all gone. We don't have to do it again now for 5 years. Health is a choice. And the reason why churches decline is most churches do not make the difficult choices. So when you look at the report, you're going to say, man, we got to do that? Well, you don't have to, because Eco says the choice is up to you. But if we want to grow, we have to do this, we have to do this, we have to do this. Yeah. Because we are finding that if churches will make these choices, God again shows up. And because only God grows the church, and the church begins to grow. So, health is that which is healthy grows and reproduces. Now, I want to talk about this for a minute. We normally, in the church talk about maturity. We're supposed to be maturing. It hit me a while back that whether you're a plant, an animal, a human, the sign that you're maturing is that you can reproduce. So when a teenager goes through puberty, no teenager's mature. We know that because we've all been one. But we say that teenager is in the process of maturing. The problem is we don't believe that in the church. We believe that maturity comes with tenure. I've been a Presbyterian for 20 years. I'm mature. I've been on the session 3 times. I'm mature. I've been to Bible study fellowships for 25 years. I'm mature. I would argue if you've been to Bible study fellowships for 25 years and you haven't helped reproduce a new Christian, you are not mature. You're constipated. Because all that's happened is taken in and taken in and taken in and taken in and taken in, and nothing's happened. So the first assumption I'm making is, and what I'm here to talk to you about this weekend and today is about health. What's it look like to be healthy? But then the choice is going to have to be yours. Do we want to make these tough choices or don't we? Okay, so that's the first assumption. Second assumption. Jesus did not create the church for Christians. He created the church to mobilize Christians to reach people who weren't Christians yet. Matthew 16. I will build my church. Why? Next line. Basically, so the gates of hell will not prevail. He didn't say, I'm going to build a church so you can gather on Sunday for wonderful worship. I've heard a lot of good things here about music. I'm going to build my church so you can gather on Sunday to hear the Word of God preached well. Again, I've heard good things about preaching. I'm going to build my church so you can gather on Sunday to see all your friends. You have not disappointed me. I have yet to meet the second friendliest church in town. And I've heard that here. We're friendly. Now, every church says that. Let me talk about that for a minute. What churches don't understand is if friendliness grew churches, the churches in the United States ought to be booming. What they don't understand is that when people come to church, they expect you to be friendly. You don't get credit for that. You get demerits if you're hostile. And I've been in hostile churches. But you don't get credit for being friendly. Okay. It's like my son when he was 5 said, Dad, can I have an allowance for brushing my teeth? I said, no. You do that. You don't get paid for that. Now, I believe your church in many ways is friendly. For the size you are, you're probably friendlier than most churches your size. But if friendliness grew churches, you wouldn't be declining. Okay. So we've got to talk about how do you deal with that issue. Now, is worship important? It is. Is preaching and teaching the Word of God important? It is. Is fellowship important? It is. But those are to be means to an end. We've made them the ends. But they are means to an end, which is the depopulation of Satan's zip code. And that's not happening across the United States. And it's not happening here. One of the questions I asked almost everybody, not everybody, almost, where are people coming to Jesus with regularity and consistency in the life of your congregation? And they could say, well, it happens here once in a while. It may happen here, mostly with children and youth, few related to Alpha. Some of you, I've heard a lot of people come to Alpha in the past, but it's not happening now. And part of this weekend is to call you back as a church to the main thing. So, that which is healthy grows and reproduces. The gospel never changed. Or the purpose of the church is not for Christians, but to mobilize Christians to help people who become Christians who aren't. Third assumption. The gospel never changes. But the church must change constantly. The gospel never changes. But the church must change constantly. I've already heard numbers of times around here, they said, Paul, the biggest problem you're going to face is the 7 last words of the church. We've never done it that way before. Okay. And I understand that. Okay. If you look at Scripture, in Acts 2, 3,000 people come to Christ. Anybody remember how often they meet? Every day. Sometimes they're in homes. Once in a while they get like the 500-pound gorilla, go up to the temple, take over the Solomon's porch and have a worship service. So the rest of people, if you want to stay, you can. But we're going to worship God. By Acts 20, the church is meeting 1 day a week at night in homes. This is where Paul preaches and Eutychus falls asleep and falls out the window. Paul was the first boring preacher. Put Eutychus to sleep. Okay. Do you realize that in the first 300 years of the church, when it grew the most, the church for the most part for the most part never had buildings. They met in homes, and if the church got too big and they didn't have another home, they went outdoors. And it generally met at night because most people were slaves. And if you're a slave, you don't say to the slave master, it's 10 o'clock, I have to go to church. Slave master says, no, you go to church on your time. My time is from the time the sun comes up to the sun goes down. And yet that's when the church grew. There's a church in Charleston, South Carolina that's over 200 years old. Then the 1800s changed the time of Sunday worship every month. And the reason they did that was that most of the people who attended that church lived on islands in the Charleston Harbor. And you don't go to church at low tide. You only go to church at high tide. So if they didn't change the time of worship, some Sundays everybody would be there, and other Sundays nobody would be there. Now, when I grew up in the 1950s in the church, every church I knew met at 11 o'clock. In fact, the pastor used to refer to it as the sacred hour, as though in Thessalonians it said, thou shalt meet at 11 o'clock. It was not the sacred hour. It was the milking the cows hour. Because at the turn of the previous century, most churches were little towns. Many people had dairy cows. They said, by the time we milk the cows, take a bath, get in the buckboard where you can be there at 11 o'clock. The church said, fine, we'll start at 11 o'clock. God allowed me for 15 years to see him do a miracle with a group of churches. In 1997, I moved to Northern California to function as an executive presbyter. That would be what the term you would use in your denomination, over 220 congregations. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, many of those congregations were congregations of 400, 500, 800, just like your congregation was in 2003, 2004, over 900 people on a Sunday. When we got there, we did a survey, first month or two, of all the congregations. Average attendance for all 220 churches was 100 people on a Sunday. So I would walk into churches that used to be 400, 500, 600, and there'd be 50, 60 people. Average age would be 75. No children, no teenagers, and the vision for most of those people was they hoped the church would remain viable enough that when they died they could have their funeral there. I reminded them that's not a great vision. I mean, minimally it takes 4 to carry a coffin. Somebody's going to have to turn out the lights. Who's it going to be? And God did a miracle, because only God grows the church. And in 5 years, we went from 37 churches that were growing out of 220 to 153 churches that were growing. And many of those churches are larger today than they ever were in their past. In the next 10 years, we planted 100 churches out of 108 attempts. By the way, we never gave a church more than $50,000. We said to church planners, and by the way, you don't get that 50 if you can't raise 50. Okay? And by the way, once you get it, you have to hit milestones to actually spend it. Okay? Over a period of those 15 years, we saw over 25,000 people become brand new disciples of Jesus in the lives of our church. Now, by the way, I hope you understand that my heroes are old people. They can change. We had no younger people. We had no empty nesters. I mean, I told some of the churches, I'm 75 now, I could be the youth pastor. Okay, so when they began to catch a vision for what God wanted to do, they said, we're going to make the tough choices. Okay. In fact, now, when I got there, here's what I told them. If 1955 comes back, you're ready. Some of our churches still had green shag carpet. Old couches don't die, they crawl away to youth rooms. Okay.